Hi, I'm Allison O'Toole, editor of the Shades of Fear anthology, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Allison O'Toole about the graphic novel anthology Shades of Fear. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. It's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe and hit the notification button. Allison is an award-winning freelance comics editor with experience managing anthologies, multi-issue series, and standalone graphic novels that include Afterlift, The Pitiful Human Lizard, Public Domain, Newburn, The All-Nighter, Called Into Being, A Celebration of Frankenstein, and much, much more. With excellent communication skills, attention to detail, and the administrative experience to bring a project from concept to reality, Allison is an asset to any comics team. Allison's latest editorial project, Shades of Fear, is co-edited by Ignatz Award winner Ashanti Fortson, Lee Leif, and Wayward Kindred. Shades of Fear is described as an anthology of subtle psychological horror comics with a focus on emotional and evocative color. The collection features 11 new chilling tales, 150 pages of stunning full-color artwork. Shades of Fear will creep under your skin, making you know the horror of loss and sacrifice, of what lurks in liminal spaces, and the unknowable that lies just beyond the veil. The collection features stories by Dessalina Fletcher, Ashanti Fortson, Amber Huff, Mar Julia, Molly Mendoza, Grendel Mentz, Tessanelli Raid, Joy San, Olivia Stevens, Shannon Wright, and Jade Zhang. And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Allison O'Toole about the graphic novel anthology Shades of Fear. So, Allison O'Toole, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I'm excited to talk.
Oh, I appreciate your time. But before we get started, though, I want to ask you, what's on your bedside reading table? What are you reading today?
Last night, I finally started Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, which is a really touching, lovely coming-of-age story. I'm really enjoying it.
And you're finding time to actually get to read these days, eh?
Oh, not often. You happened to catch me the day after I was started a book for the first time in like a month. I think part of the job is trying to keep up on what's out and reading other comics. I'm not only reading the ones that I'm working on. So I try to get to bed 15 or 20 minutes early before lights out so I can read a little bit before I turn the light off. But I would be lying if I said I actually did that every night.
Well, it's a good goal to have, that's for sure. Well, we're here talking about your latest project, the graphic novel anthology Shades of Fear. I want to ask you, what is the book about and what inspired you to put it together?
So Shades of Fear is a collection of short horror comics with a focus on color. So the sort of genesis of this project was kind of a melding between my interests and Ashanti Fortson's, my co-editor. Ashanti is an absolute expert when it comes to color. They've been a comics educator as well as a creator. And I know that they just have such a sharp eye for that, where I am a big horror buff. I've always loved horror in all mediums. And I think that there are a ton of exceptions to this rule, of course, but I think that a lot of the iconic horror comics that we think of tend to be affiliated with black and white. People think of the old EC horror comics, that sort of stuff. They think of Junji Ito and other horror manga now. But I think there are a lot of horror films that have used color in a really effective narrative way, like films like Suspiria, for example, is one we talked about a lot. So I wanted to explore the ways that color can be used as a storytelling device within the medium of comics, and specifically within the genre of horror. And that's how this book came together.
Ah, okay, because I was looking at the promotional line for the book. It says, experience terror in blood red, sickly yellow, and ethereal blue. So I guess that was really one of the guidelines you gave to creators before they started, right?
Yeah, it absolutely was. So we reached out to a group of creators who, some of whom have published horror experience, some of whom don't, but who we knew had an eye for color and how that influences storytelling. And so that was how we kind of put our roster together. Was we knew that if not everybody was as into horror as I am, we could have some really interesting angles on what a horror story looks like. But we were confident that all these creators know color and would know how to use it in a really like emotionally effective way.
The preview copy that you provided to me definitely shows that for sure. There's some stories in there I just went, whoa. So definitely did your job there for sure. So you talked about bringing people on board for this project. Can you talk a wee bit about the artists who are helping out?
Yeah, absolutely. I can do a really quick rundown. So Ashanti, my co-editor, wrote and drew one of the stories in the collection. We've also got a few names people might not be familiar with yet who are sort of up-and-comers, as well as some more established creators that have some more publishing credits. We wanted kind of a mix of both. We've got some folks like Dessalina Fletcher, Grendel Menz, Jade Zhang, as well as some horror creators like Joy San and Olivia Stevens, Shannon Wright, who had a sort of young adult book come out, or a middle grade book rather, come out last year, but has been wanting to do horror. Tess Ennerly Reed is the same, has been interested in horror, but never really made any. And then we had some folks like Olivia Stevens, Molly Mendoza, and Mar Julia, who have dabbled in horror to varying degrees, but also have really strong indie and mainstream track records. So we thought that this would be a good blend of styles, names people might know from different kind of avenues, and who would all bring really different angles and styles to the project.
Absolutely, yeah, it shows, that's for sure. So how did you find these people? Was it just networking, or did you put out a call, or was it just you knew exactly who to go after and you got them on board?
Honestly, yeah, it was kind of, we both came up with long lists, Ashanti and I, of folks that we either knew personally or had worked with before or whose work we were interested in. And we just reached out to a bunch of folks, and, there were names we had on the list that weren't available, but we were so lucky that these folks all had the time or made the time in their schedules to work with us on this. And because we have a slightly smaller roster than you might see in sort of similar anthologies, it meant that we could let them make longer comics. So some of the comics in here are, between 15 and 20 pages. So it gives them a little bit more space and a little bit more breathing room to tell their stories than on some of the books I've worked on in the past.
Can you talk a bit about the editorial process? Was it the same for every creator, where you accepted the project and then you gave some notes and then they came back to you? Can you explain how it went?
So with anthologies, I tend to have kind of a timeline set up so everyone's kind of on the same page. Last summer, when we were planning the project and planning the Kickstarter, we wanted to make sure that we had kind of a rough idea of what each story was going to be about, so that we could get a piece of art that we called like posters for the stories that we could use in promotion. So those are what you'll find on the Kickstarter, because we wanted to fund this upfront before people started making the comics. And so we started out by saying everybody can give us 2 pitches with not just your narrative, but also your color approach involved. So, for example, Olivia Stevens from early on had a really clear idea that she wanted to explore kind of feelings of warmth and family contrasted to the horror. And so she wanted to see if she could make a horror story using pastel colors, as an example. So she has a lot of like really soft pinks and greens in her story. So that was part of her original pitch. And that was part of the way that we chose which pitch to use from each contributor, to make sure that the tones of the stories were varied, but so were the kind of color approaches, so that it wouldn't feel repetitive, I guess. And so each story would feel very individual, I guess, is a better way of saying that. But yeah, once we had the pitches locked in, it was a pretty typical process. Different people work in slightly different ways. So some folks were kind of thumbnailing before they were scripting. But for the most part, we just sort of do like script, layouts, and then sometimes folks would do separate pencils and ink. Sometimes they wouldn't, depends on the person. And then colors and letters were often kind of folded in. But you get the pages at each stage. You review. You sometimes work with some of the creators. We had calls and conversations to talk about their goals with the comics because, as I say, some of them are a little bit more experimental. They're less narrative driven in a traditional comic sense. So we had some conversations about like, what are you trying to achieve with this and how can we make sure that that is being achieved in the most effective way possible. But generally, when you're managing this many people on the same or similar timelines, it's a lot easier to have sort of goalposts that everyone's hitting just so you can keep track of everything.
Yeah, it must be a chore, I guess, to say to some degree to keep everyone on track so you are hitting those milestones.
It's not so bad. I mean, it's part of the job. I mean, that's my whole job as an editor, whether it's an anthology or something else, is keeping people on time as much as possible. And to be honest, it was a lot easier on this book than it has been on others because not only do we only have 10 stories in the finished book, plus illustrations by Amber Huff, but we also only have single people working on each story. That was part of it as well. We wanted, because the color concept and the art approach was so key to the base pitch and so core to the concept, we didn't want to have like teams on any of these stories. And so there was a lot less of a headache when you don't have to be sending files to people who are waiting for them. You're not running into issues with creative differences between different people on the team. It's very unified and it's very clear from the beginning so that because you only have one person, they know what each part has to look like. We're not going to have to manage different people's feedback. You know what I mean? So this one was comparatively quite easy. That's good. In the grand scheme of things.
That's good. I know that when I talk to some artists or creators, usually they give out advice to get your start in anthology. It's usually an easy way in. As an editor who's on the receiving line, what advice would you give to those newcomers who are thinking about getting into an anthology if they find one? Do you have any advice, any tips that you might suggest that would make it easier overall for the process?
Absolutely. So I can think of a couple things. At the pitching stage, if it's an anthology with an open call for pitches, I would say make sure that your story pitch has all the plot details. So spoil the ending. Editors don't want you to tease it and not tell them what's going to happen. But also make sure that it's tailored to what the anthology is looking for. There are a lot of folks who will send in stories that are great, but they don't really fit what the anthology is about. So I would say read the brief really thoroughly. Make sure that your idea is aligned with what they're trying to achieve. And then when you're writing your bio, I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with. If it's a submissions process that wants to know a little bit about you, if you don't have a ton of published credits, don't be self-deprecating. Don't put yourself down about it. Just talk about the kinds of stories that you would like to write. Give me some adjectives for the kinds of stories that are interesting to you. And then once you're accepted into an anthology, and in any comics work really, I think it's really important to continue communicating. I know some people get a little overwhelmed. Sometimes they miss a deadline and then they're too worked up about it to communicate with the rest of their team, which makes everyone else's lives a lot harder. Even if you've got stuff that's going on, if you know you're going to miss a deadline, or if you do miss a deadline, no matter what the issue is, just keep your editorial team informed so that they know, and then they can plan to help you and support you in accordingly, which they can't do if you don't tell them what's going on. So those would be my pieces of advice. That's
great. Great tips to pass along, that's for sure. Well, I wanted to talk to you also about being editor on several books by Chip Zdarsky, including the Eisner Award-winning Afterlift. Your most current work with him and the team is The All-Nighter. I wonder if you could talk a wee bit about the editorial process you have on that book specifically.
So The All-Nighter is probably the easiest book I've ever worked on. So as you mentioned, with Afterlift, we had a team put together that was very much a well-oiled machine. Everyone was really quick with turnarounds, very good at communicating. Everyone's work just gelled really nicely together, and Chip put that team together, so I can't take credit. But yeah, the book went so well that we decided to make another book together, and it was easy because we were just sort of doing in a lot of ways what we'd already done, only better and more crisply. And
so you knew the ins and outs, I guess. Everyone's sort of little quirks and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And again, just everyone's styles on that book just gel together in a really, really nice way. Chip's character work is really strong, like his dialogue, and Jason's layouts with character faces and reaction and pacing is really, really strong. So I think the two of them work together so well. And Paris, the colorist, and Aditya, the letterer, again, just have a really good sense of the tone and really elevate that and bring that out and make the book really exciting and heartwarming to read, I think. So that's probably the easiest book that I've ever worked on.
Well, that's good. That's good. It sounds like you've got a great team there with more success in the future, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Yes. So we've talked about a few of the projects that you've done and that you have on the go. Do you have any other up-and-coming books that you can talk about?
That I can talk about is the question there, John. I don't think it's a secret that we are eventually going to come back on Newburn with Chip and Jacob Phillips. That one will come back. We're trying to figure out when at the moment. But otherwise, I mean, yeah, I'm also doing Chip's Public Domain that's coming out with Image at the moment, and I love. But everything else I think is still under NDA.
Okay.
I'm sorry. But
that's okay.
Fun
Say
stuff,
no more.
though. Fun stuff is coming.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you'll be able to tell us when the time is right, and certainly you'll be promoting that when the time is right. So do you have a website where you recommend people go to find out more about your current and your future projects?
I do. It's just AllisonO'Toole.com. It's got list of credits. It's got contact if you want to talk to me about a project you want to develop or just want to talk about comics. I'm also on Twitter at Allison M. O'Toole.
Very good. Well, Allison, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
Shades of Fear is available on Gumroad in a PDF format, so you can get it there. And I don't have many conventions planned for this year. I just had COVID, so I'm a little COVID wary. I'm going to be at Canzine in October. And otherwise, I'm not 100% sure yet. But I hope that next year, myself and the contributors will be doing a number of shows in Canada and the US. So if you want to get your hands on a physical copy, you want to meet some of our contributors, look them up. Their work is all amazing. And if anyone's at a show near you, they should have copies. So you can get a copy from them.
Thanks to Allison for the chat. You can discover more about Allison on Twitter at Allison M. O'Toole and online at AllisonO'Toole.com. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2022.